Hello. I just finished a conversation with Philip Clayton that I know you're really going to enjoy. Philip was my doctoral chair when I was a student at Claremont School of Theology. And in this conversation, we talk about how we met and the synchronicities that led me to then study with him at Claremont School of Theology. And I've just found him to be such an amazing scholar. He works at the intersection of philosophy, religion, and science. And we talk about his recent book, Science and the Sacred, that he co-wrote with Claudia Pierce. And so he is now living in Washington State and professor emeritus from Claremont School of Theology. Um, and he's still working, still writing, still teaching, and is just such a great thinker and theologian and philosopher, and just brings such amazing depth of knowledge to his work and to this conversation. And so I'm thrilled to be able to share this conversation with you, and I hope that you enjoy it. Welcome to The Sacred Everywhere. I'm Dr. Sheri Kling, and in this space we explore how the sacred shows up in real life, in our questions, our struggles, our longing, and our hope. Can we find the sacred in every place and everyone? Let's see. Welcome, Philip Clayton, to The Sacred Everywhere. So good to have you.
Sheri, it's great to be on your show.
Well, I want to, before we dive into lots of topics, and I know we could have hours of conversation, and obviously we can't spend hours today, but before we dive into some topics, I want to just bring to our memory the kind of synchronistic that I saw as synchronistic events that led to our meeting and then working together at Claremont School of Theology. So, I was a student at the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And when I started there, I really didn't know what I wanted to emphasize and what I wanted to focus my studies on. So I got very interested because of my interest in Jung and psychology. I decided to jump into the religion and science program there and was part of the Religion and Science Student Society. Meanwhile, in 2010, which was my second semester, I was taking a class in process theology with Anna Case Winters, and she mentioned, oh, Claremont School of Theology as like the center of process studies. And I thought, oh, that's interesting. Huh. And I was getting very interested in process theology and then seeing resonances with Jung and, got all interested in that. And so then I looked up the Center for Process Studies and found you listed as a co-director. And then right after that, I saw the postcard that you were going to be speaking at the Religion and Science Conference at Goshen College that spring. And I thought, oh my gosh, he's like going to be like right down the road. And then, then I spoke with the leadership of the student society who said, oh, well, we can cover your expenses to go to that conference. And by the way, would you like to be a student responder when Dr. Clayton is here at LSTC, the day before the conference
Yep.
began? So of course I said yes to that. And you came and talked, and then I was one of the three student responders. And I just felt like that experience with you, you were such a generous and open-minded and open-hearted scholar. And you really, I mean, that you just really engaged so beautifully with all of us who were students there. And that really impressed me. And then the next day, we were in Goshen and had some conversation, and I was giving you my list of areas of interest and bringing this Jungian thing, and really wanted to work with you. And I remember you initially said, well, I don't know if you want to do a PhD, it's expensive, and if you can do what you want to do without doing that, I'd recommend it. But I was coming off a period of self-employment and didn't want to just be hanging out a shingle anymore with our credentials. So anyway, needless to say, I then applied to Claremont and then ended up working with you as my advisor, my doctor father, as they say in Germany, and just found that to be such a great great experience, and we've become colleagues and friends ever since. So I just wanted to bring that to the surface here, and just and maybe ask you to comment on your own thoughts about that time period, and then like what about like my areas of interest did you even find
Mhm.
interesting?
Yeah. It was the time period when Lutheran School of Theology could pay for a student to go to a conference,
Yeah,
right? There was a
right.
financial time, and it was not that many years ago when we were able to travel and be together. So it's like AC, the before the common era and in the common era is before Zoom and after Zoom.
Yeah.
And but most of all, it's a demonstration of why it's so important to listen to synchronicity. I think we were both attuned to that
Mm-hmm.
in the discussion, the talk, the meeting. We chatted some then, and then here's this Goshen College conference, which was famous for wide open spaces, lots of conversation. I remember lunch outdoor at the cafeteria on the patio, a beautiful day, and being able to start exploring the issues. And
Yeah.
also, academic decisions are not made merely by the head. And I think that there was a natural trust and respect that grew up even from those first conversations. I always like to think of students as peers and what I have to learn. And you established that with your maturity, your analy thinking through your period as a professional musician, traveling, composing, and what that transition would mean into academics and the kinds of, if I can use the word in quote, ministries that would be open to you afterwards.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
also, the last thing I would say is you never know in a relationship how variegated it's actually going to be. So we started with, that academic discussion, but we had interest in music and performance in common. What are some of the roles we've played? You played multiple leadership roles when I was at CST in a position of administrative leadership.
Mm-hmm.
You wrote a grant that when I was leading the Institute for Ecological Civilization that brought about $6 million to the city of Pomona to launch an office for violence prevention and neighborhood well-being.
Yeah.
And then you became a fundraiser for the three nonprofits after your graduation, as we were trying to become financially stable and launch a legacy giving program. And on it goes. And now here I come as a guest in your territory on your podcast. So synchronicity with a capital S.
For sure, definitely. And what a joy it brings when you pay attention and
Yeah.
can acknowledge and then jump into the places where it's leading. I always say, I was through so many downsizings in the software industry over the years, and it got to be where it was, okay, here's another one. And I would always say to my colleagues, don't just keep looking for what you did before. Look for where the energy is moving. Where is there a
Mhm.
conversation that comes to life and sparks something of interest? And so that's I think a big part of it. So
Mhm.
I'm glad I followed those promptings in my own life.
One of my major hopes for this two-part conversation is that we will be listening to that same still small voice of synchronicity as we do this discussion. And I believe that we'll be listening not only to a flow of an argument or a disputation between two positions, but underlying harmonies, um, resonances, and dissonances,
Hmm.
all sorts of things that are below the surface of rationality to begin to introduce Jung at an early stage.
I love it. I love it. All right, so I want to you've got a recent book out called Science and the Sacred, and you recently presented on that book for the Process Explorations group. And I just wanted before you talk about the book, I wanted to ask you what is it that drew you into this whole arena of religion and science? Because you've been doing this for a long time and have quite a reputation in this area. So what made you put those two together?
Yeah. As the years have gone by, I realized that that's a broader and broader question.
Mm,
When it started, what would I have been aware of? Um, I was raised in an atheist family in Northern California. My father was not only atheist, but radically atheist, written his PhD dissertation on the critique of religion in George Bernard Shaw.
Mm.
My mother was spiritual but not religious, and that played a large role as time went on. So I suddenly uh, got Christ in when I was in my sophomore year of high school. In retrospect, I recognized that it was a great form of teenage rebellion against a father figure. I remember coming home from Mount Hermon to Santa Rosa and at the breakfast table telling my parents that God had created the first two human beings directly and that they sinned. Everyone's going to hell, but Jesus Christ is the only way, and I'm going to heaven and you're not.
Mm.
And I remember my father, for the first time in his life, was silent in shock. The greatest
Wow.
14-year-old, 15-year-old teenage rebellion ever. And my mother wept silently into her cereal that her son would have gone so far astray from the values of the family.
Mm.
Uh, I applied to Stanford, but since my father didn't seem to care, I chose a conservative Christian college, Westmont College in Santa Barbara instead, Fuller Seminary, and then a time of hitchhiking around Europe. And I began to let go of that sort of radical, white knuckle approach to religion and rediscover the spirituality. This book, so that led me always to wonder what are the reasons for this Christian faith? And science and religion was my way of answering. Science kind of represented my father. Could I have a faith that was compatible with and could overcome the arguments of this oppositional force, father slash science? Um, the fact that with an amazing woman and co-author, Claudia Pierce, we wrote this book on science and spirituality in a completely different vein, a completely different dance than that early beginning of my career, is for me personally maybe the most important autobiographical feature of the book.
Wow. It's that reminds me of when I was at LSTC working with Leah Schweitz
Yeah.
and who so sadly passed so young recently. But I remember saying to her when I was doing my master's thesis, like, I feel like I'm just processing my own childhood wounds through theology. And she said, well, that's what we all do.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
And and then I went on to, draw from women talking about embodied theology, and I think that comes to my mind too as you speak, that we're and even I'm reminded of your book on theology where you talked about that we're all doing theology.
Hmm.
And I think people might be put off by that term. People who aren't theology nerds might be put off by the term. Well, who cares about theology? But it's really looking at well, thinking of Paul Tillich here, what are our matters of ultimate concern,
Yeah. Yeah.
and how do we understand our place in the world, our place in the whole, our relationship to the sacred, our relationship to meaning. And so to me, it's more than just, oh, this is just all about religion and I'm not interested in religion, if someone out there is saying that. It's
Yeah.
about what is really at the heart and soul of this thing we call life, and how do
Yeah.
we relate to it.
Think of the resonances of the three words you just used in that comment. First, science and theology. And I'm
Hmm.
not even going to say them because you and every listener will hear something in that combination of terms. The two loud nouns on the side and this and word that we wonder what it means. Then you said science and religion.
Hmm.
All right, now I feel a different resonance between those two, and the and has a different connotation. But at one point, you used the word sacred, which is the word we chose for the book. Science and the sacred is for me radically different because, as we know from Paul Tillich, for example, the sacred is whatever that thing is, which lies at the heart of your being, yourself, your values, the way you seek to live your life in the world. And we owe that to Claudia, who,
Mm.
as I'll describe later, passed after we'd finished the book, but not completely finished the revisions and found the publisher. Uh, she recognized that the sacred is a bridge between science and all the fields of religion that is much more welcoming and easier traveled than many
Mm.
of the alternatives.
Yeah, it seems to have more breathing space.
Yeah, nice. Yes.
It seems more porous and more
Yeah.
fluid than those other terms, theology, religion.
And in a sense, that's what I most hope for our conversation, that we hear those resonances in all the different levels. We can be conceptual, but we can be experiential. And in every conversation about the book, and really I'm for everybody's reading experience of the book, I hope they accept that invitation. This is a wide open door, not a narrow academic specialization.
Yeah. So you talked about when your writing process with this book that it was you in dialogue with Claudia, but also that your friend Damien was a third, and the dynamic that played in the work that you were doing. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, and I think that dynamic honors what the Center for Process Studies was during the years you were there, and really in its history for many years. It was a place where these kinds of broad, open conversations would take place. So I had done a lecture series on an earlier book on science and religion, a textbook that I'm just doing its third edition now.
Mm,
And Claudia came up to me after the presentations and said, so I appreciate your slides and you're doing this talk, but basically you're not very good at communicating with a broader audience. And I think that we should do a book that retells this story for anyone to be able to pick up and have access to. And that was how the idea was born.
mm,
And so the first thing, there was another person in the audience, a friend of both of ours named Damon Gedry, former advertising executive who became a brilliant advisor to churches and other religious communities of how to market themselves better, and a deep thinker in the process world. So we would begin to meet for these evening dinners on European style. So dinner means 4 hours. And we'd eat, we'd sit outside in chairs as the sun went down, and just wander through this whole maze of issues that get raised when you're talking about science, process, religion, spirituality. There were a lot of oppositions. At times, we were more rigorously process and Whiteheadian, dealing with these very complicated in metaphysical issues. At times, we expressed anger or concern about religions and how they treated people. One of us was queer and had felt those sorts of rejections as well. Um, and also, then what do the bridges look like when we find a harmony between the various parts? Taking that the musical metaphor, which I really mean literally, that
mm,
we can sense harmonies on the surface and below the surface, just like we sense resonances and overtones in, say, singing with the madrigals choir. And
yeah.
we wanted the book to have that kind of resonance, invite people in, not just at the conscious level. And I owe that to those two people and to those conversations.
Wow. Wow. Yeah, it just seems like there's a whole different dynamic when there's three than when there's
Yeah.
two. And there's that way that uh two can be just oppositional, but three brings in a flow that is different.
What you've just introduced is a rich metaphor. I grew up in well, I had a short period as an evangelical Christian where it was always twos. There were always oppositions. There's us and them, basically, and they
Right.
were wrong, and here's why. And them, say the new atheists, had very much the same approach. Uh, we have the truth, and you guys are crazy, as we know from Richard Dawkins' tones
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
writing. Um, but also Christopher Hitchens, who was writing at that time, and others. By contrast, the dialectical traditions, like those are the traditions which say that there's one and the other, and then there's some sort of fusion there's a German word that just can't be translated. It's called Aufheben, and means the best English translation is transcended yet preserved.
Ah,
Just
uh-huh.
pause and hear that resonance for a moment. T- You've got an opposition, you transcend it, the opposition, yet you preserve the distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of us more mystically inclined, that already suggests a mystical place where things that are conceptually in tension still manifest a kind of deeper unity.
Mm,
That's the spirit, I think, of threeness, whether dialectic of three people talking, three positions in interaction, um, groups that recognize both the importance of our differences and the importance of our similarities. Do you see it's a life metaphor, really?
yeah, it is. It is. And of course, it reminds me of Carl Jung's idea of the transcendent function and the
Yeah,
psyche, which
yeah,
which he talked about if we're willing to hold the tension between opposing sides within us without repressing one in favor of the other, because that repression then just drives that
yeah,
repressed position into the unconscious, where it then becomes the agenda that's fueling everything we do from underneath. But
yeah,
if we can hold the tension until the third transcendent uh, possibility emerges that includes both, that's the key thing. It doesn't repress either side, it transcends but includes.
yeah.
And
Transcends and yet preserves.
yeah,
That is a life lesson that if we could apply that not only to our personal relationships, but to our academic debates and the ways that our spirituality seems to, no, actually conflicts with other parts of our life or things that are demanded of us or things inside our psyche,
yeah,
and then have a more Jungian understanding that while there are real conflicts, they also can inhabit a space where the unity is also felt.
right, right. Yeah, that's great. And Lord knows we could use that same exact approach in our politics right now. It just seems that, all we end up with is oppositions, and there's no transcendence and inclusion.
Yeah. I've been
Yeah.
speaking recently across the United States on depolarization in
Mm,
religion and politics. I was in Odessa, Texas, just a few weeks ago, at an event of 300 people, hosted by a Muslim group in town, which is even more interesting, talking about depolarization. And they told me coming in, all right, I know you're from Washington and you hold liberal values and your theology is fairly liberal. I just want to tell you that everyone in the room is going to be Republican. 95% are going to be Christian, and they're going to be a conservative Christian. So just keep that in mind.
uh-huh.
And so we approached depolarization as a general idea without the specifics yet. Um, and I showed clips of a young man in New York City doing interviews on street corners where he'd find one or two people and he'd use the methods of the biggest depolarization society um, in the US called Braver Angel. Braver
Mm,
Angels
yeah,
seeks to get people to go beyond the dichotomies.
yeah.
And he'd have a 45-second edited, now in the end, discussion. And at the end, he'd rate himself. Either he failed to find a point of connection, the
Uh-huh.
polarities continued, or success.
Wow.
And that got people laughing. And then I said, let's talk about the religious differences and how we could live together. So
Mm,
I completely agree with you that depolarization and this kind of synthesis, holding differences with tensions but with commonalities, are inseparable. Whether it's
yeah.
politics you just mentioned, or religion, or cultural differences, and on and on.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Wow. So I want to go back to the book a little bit, The Science and the Sacred book. And there were some things where you talked about like science and creation. And in one section wrote, although the Big Bang could have happened without a divine creator, it certainly allows for the possibility of one. And it just that whole section reminded me of certain experiences that I'd had back in the mid 90s. The first, I was in Canyon de Chelly and had this, change to my consciousness where I was sitting on the edge of the canyon and all of a sudden experienced myself as like this infinitesimally small speck of dust in the universe, but deeply, intimately connected to everything and part of the whole. And um and then later, while I was at LSTC and was flying out of Midway Airport to go somewhere, and I had taken the bus from school to the airport, which I had not done before. And so the hallway that I moved through after getting off the bus, that at that time was full of images from the Hubble telescope, like
Mm,
big, prints of those images. And I was just like, I just had to stop, and I was overcome with emotion, and
yeah.
there was a sense in me of this is home, like
Wow.
of homecoming in those images. And I was so moved by all of that. It happened I'm sure this was not a coincidence, but at the same time there was an exhibit, an IMAX movie on the repairing of the Hubble telescope at the
Hmm.
Museum of Science and Industry. So
Hmm.
when I got back from that trip, bought a ticket and put myself like in the center seat, where I could
Oh, cool.
experience those images like I was in them. And it also just was so emotional. And it just tied directly to that experience in the canyon, which it's interesting because I've been reflecting on that experience a lot in my own yearnings right now, because I've just for my whole life have kind of felt like somehow I've missed that sense of love, of
Mm.
really being loved, being held in love, being myself as love. I have friends, I have loving relationships. I've not ever found that one romantic relationship. And so that, I think, unfortunately, is sort of like the standard bearer for me. And
Yeah, right.
that's what I'm trying to release, is that need for just that particular type of experience, but still that yearning for divine love. And I
Yeah.
just was reflecting on that canyon experience as it came with this ineffable sense of connectedness, but it didn't, like a lot of people's experiences, whether they be NDEs or elsewhere, it didn't have that feeling of being loved. And
Mm.
it's just interesting to me. We can't demand we can't
Yeah.
demand our mystical experiences arrive in a certain way, but I don't know, what experiences have you had that kind of connect those dots with, whether it's, the sacred or the metaphysics of the universe and the cosmos? Like, where have you glimpsed things that touched you at a real deep level?
Yeah. That's a very personal response and invites an equally personal response. I had never realized that our mystical experiences were in parallel. We never talked about this before.
Hmm.
Um, and it invites me to clarity as well as I think back over the years. Though I was raised in an atheist family, in some ways that actually opened up the space for what I'm going to just outright call mystical experiences from a young age. I remember in high school, a friend whom I'd known since third grade used to say that God was in the flowers and the grass and the hills and the rolling hills of Northern California.
Hmm.
And I realized that that had always just been there. It was a sort of loner kid, and I would walk out into the forest and the hills, which are exquisitely beautiful in
Yeah.
Sonoma County and over to the ocean there at the Pacific.
Hmm.
And that was my experience of the divine. They were so strong that I remember in high school, actually, I know right where we were in England, walking at nighttime across the meadows and feeling like the presence of the divine was so close that I was almost scared.
Hmm.
There was something there. Yeah, that's just been a portion of my life always. And I often invite people to recognize how close those are. Do you remember the famous poem by Wordsworth, who on an evening is walking in the countryside above Tintern Abbey up a small creek? And as it begins to get darker, and he's describing all the things he sees concretely, but then at one point he experiences and I have known the joys of a sense divine, something far more deeply interfused,
Hmm.
whose dwelling place is the blue sky and the round air and in the minds of men.
Mm,
Uh, so there, I think it really does permeate and us and is is that close at any instant. I mean, it can be sitting in a forest or a park and closing your eyes and taking 3 deep breaths, and suddenly you feel some kind of connection. And if you love that, if you're drawn to it, if you sit with it, it's easy for that sense of connection to grow. And that for me is that open doorway to what people talk in very esoteric terms about mystical experiences. But to me, there is every day as, walking through a day. But like you, I had them as a very broad sense of connection without the sense of encountering an other who loves me intimately.
mm,
I would say that in my first sort of dramatic experience that led me to Christianity at 15, that was there. I immediately moved into the charismatic movement. That was a part of the charismatic movement, both in Catholic churches and Protestants, and we could talk about that in detail. Um, More recently, as I'm now comfortable with using a sort of Buddhist meditation together with a sense of prayer. I practice in the Religious Society of Friends, so I'm a Quaker. And our worship, my most honest hour of the week is to sit in silence with a number of friends and
mm.
just listen to the inner light. And now it's so familiar. It's not the overwhelming, I've just found Christ experience of
Uh-huh.
being a 15-year-old, but it is also not just distant and quasi-metaphysical. It
Mm,
comes with a warmth of familiarity, and this is the last thing I'll say. Um, it comes now more easily because I'm not afraid of the question, is this just projection? Am I just hearing myself here? And I hope we'll get into this theme because when you're confident enough that the divine and your innermost self can be blended and be experienced as blended, there's much more chance to find self-love, love of other, love of nature, love of the all-encompassing divine.
yeah, that's incredible. Well, and and even more recently, I've, been had different experiences where I went into them wanting this like encounter with God and this
Me
sense
too.
of blessing or love, want these things. But what happened instead was just a deepening into myself and a rising up of self-love, self-forgiveness,
Yes.
self-holding, and I think that that's not accidental. I
Yeah.
think, the God is trying to tell me, you need to find me in you
Yeah.
and
Yes.
stop looking
Yes.
for
That's
me
so
outside of
important.
you.
We have this notion it's got to be this cosmic God, and you have to be abandoned. I'm dust. I'm not worthy of touching, the hem of your garment.
Hmm.
And or it's not truly a religious experience. But what you just said is the heart of a religious experience, of a spiritual experience. When when the gift is self-love, when the gift is the sense of being touched by something that is not other and yet also transcends. That's just a beautiful and extremely important piece of advice for
Yeah,
people who are beginning this or are long-term practitioners of the inner journey.
right, right, right. Oh boy. Yeah, I'm still on the journey.
Yeah.
Still experiencing and seeking and relating and listening, and it's a lifelong journey.
Yeah.
Um, and
It's
and go ahead.
I was just going to say, if anyone approaches it as I'm an expert, then you're off the path.
Yeah.
So everybody has to begin each time as a beginner. I once told my spiritual director, I've been struggling with overcoming ego, and I think, I just don't need to stress that all the time. And I walked out of the door from the session and I barely made it 3 steps. It's like, no, that's wrong. There's a sense in which the struggle with ego is always a problem. And so now I begin meditation and I make a beginner's error of my mind wandering off or ceasing to pay attention to my breath. And I realize that I'm an absolute beginner every time, even
Mm,
after all these decades. And only in that way is the path inward made available.
yeah,
Ego is actually anyone who says I'm an expert meditator, you should look at them a second time. Really?
really.
I mean, there are people
Oh,
who have astounding ability to go deeply very quickly. So I absolutely grant that. But I also find they often have a childish excitement about their own journey, even decades in. I could tell
mm,
stories.
wow. That's neat. That's neat. Well, before we jump into part two, I guess one of the things I want to, and maybe this is too long to keep in part one, but I guess I want to just touch on because so many people are so fed up with the word God right now. They're so
Yeah.
fed up with religion. I mean, we see plunging numbers in church membership or identification with a tradition. And what did you find in your conversations with Claudia in this writing this book and with Damien that what place did you get to, I guess,
Yeah.
that enabled you to be together in this discussion of science and the sacred? How were you able to maybe set aside labels
Yeah.
and look at realities? How did you navigate that territory and where did you sort of come
Yeah.
to?
I'm so glad you asked that question because it's really what I think is valuable about the book. And for this, Claudia gets huge credit. We, for her, she's an atheist, was an atheist, a humanist, so not a believer in God, and asked us to see if we could write a book that invited people who use the G word and who don't use the G word into a dialogue that actually becomes a friendship, where through those things we recognize that we're talking about the same thing. Claudia's vision was to depolarize the word God. In fact, she felt so strongly about it that she asked us to use as the subtitle, Beyond the Gods in Our Image.
Mm,
And you see, if both sides can say there's a danger of using gods in our image, the
yeah,
atheist to deny them and the theist to affirm it, but the it is often so much in his or her own image that we're not making any progress. And every chapter, as we went through the various sciences, the doctrine of the origin of the creation, fundamental physics, biology, the history of life, neuroscience, and the emergence of consciousness. In each of these areas, and then to raise that, what is the religious question here? And to find out a way of speaking of something higher. What was the Wordsworth's phrase again? A sense sublime of something far more deeply interfused, which some call God, some call self, some call Brahman, some call the Tao, uh, and so forth. Allah,
yeah, yeah,
Yahweh, which is just breath, breathing out Yahweh, Yahweh.
yeah. Right,
Uh,
right.
then we can find common ground. And that's the experience of writing the book. And it's also the journey that we chronicle. After we'd worked through all these sections, first the major sciences, then the major religions, what are positive and what we both agree are problems. At the very end, Claudia said, okay, now we each need to write our closing statement.
Mm,
And she wrote a beautiful statement. I didn't see hers, wrote one. We brought them together, we dialogued, we revised. And that's the climax of the book. Both we got so close um, to common language. We were beyond all polarization, and we were different at the end.
mm,
I hold a very mystical sense of a God interfused with the world. The theology word is panentheism. So the world is included within the divine. The divine permeates the world, but the divine is also something more. That is so far from the evangelical theism that I had inherited as a young person.
yeah.
Claudia does not use the word theism in any part, but her sense of a value-based unity in all that exists, which is
Hmm.
accessible to us through almost any object in nature, is just a hair's breadth different. And I would just say you can't read the book, again, thanks to Claudia, without recognizing that we don't need to polarize by a meaning of God. If we lay down our weapons, let friendship and discussion and lots of good dinners and glasses of wine help us, that we can find our deep connections, mystical sometimes, for Claudia and me, values and ecology, so care for and living with the world, experiences that don't fit into the narrow categories of science and traditional psychology, then we have built those bridges and we are not opponents. We are like this. These are two
Yeah,
hands, they're different hands, but they're so intertwined and connected that their deep connection, partnership, relationship, bond is fully visible. That's my metaphor for
that's great.
for rapprochement beyond the God debates.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, let's pause here at the end of part one, and then we'll start up again in just a moment with part two.
Thanks.
Thanks for listening to the first half of this episode. If you'd like to go deeper, click on the link in the show notes to access the full episode for paid subscribers of The Sacred Everywhere on Substack. And if you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share this episode far and wide. I'd love your help to grow this channel. Until next time, may you notice the sacred everywhere.